Hey everyone, Duke Nougat 3D here, back at you again with another gas mask review, and boy do I have a particularly special one because, as you may have read in the title, today I have for you the US E6-3-7 Army Assault Gas Mask, or the M5-11-7 Army Combat Service Mask, depending on which particular era you consider. So, before I get into the history of this, I'd like to mention this is not actually mine. This technically belongs to Moulage, but it was sent to me for restoration, and it is mostly complete. There's just save for the head harness, which I need to totally reproduce a new C4 head harness assembly, just because the original one that was on this was completely rotten. But I digress. So this was a very interesting story of how we got this. So you already may know that the M5 assault masks, or the E6, whatever you prefer to call it, these are one of, if not the most sought after and historically relevant masks of the Second World War era, due to their involvement in the D-Day campaign in Normandy and all that sort of stuff. I'm not too well versed with the D-Day campaign or the D-Day invasions, but all I know is that these masks were carried during then, and that's basically what makes them command outrageous prices. Like recently there was an unissued one on eBay a while back, and it sold for well over $1,000. So that kind of shows how desired these masks are, just because people hold the D-Day invasions to such high regard, and so anything affiliated with it fetches outrageous prices for that association. But anyhow, yeah, we actually did not have to pay, because even face pieces alone without the carriers, which obviously this is just a face piece alone, they usually command up to $200 at the very least on average. This one started off as an auction, but me and Moulage managed to negotiate a deal with the seller, because the seller did not know what it was. The auction was only starting at like 99 cents, and nobody had bid on it yet, nobody was watching it, so we literally swooped in, and it's like, yo, we'll pay you $50 for this thing if you send it to us right now. And he literally just agreed, and Moulage was the one who paid for it. I'm the one who restored it, obviously, because you should have seen what the condition was like on this thing before. It was just completely filled with mold, rust, and grime everywhere. It was terrible, but this thing looks mint condition now, and I'm probably going to make a post on the US Military Forum showing the restoration process of this, because I wanted to make a video, but I'm terrible about doing restorations on camera. I cannot do it properly. I don't have the proper equipment to orientate the camera. I just need to get a new camera is what I really need to do. But anywho, I'm rambling on now, so let's get into the history. So, picture it this way. It is 1942. The U.S. military has just adopted the M3 10A16 lightweight service mask, and subsequently the M4 10A16 lightweight service mask, due to the production problems of acquiring natural rubber and them needing to set up production facilities for artificial rubbers. And the lightweight series masks were, as their name would imply, substantially lighter than the M2 and M1 series service masks, which used a larger M1 series canister and a M1 series carrier on the side, and it was just very bulky and cumbersome and not very conducive to light field use and operations, things of that nature. So even at that rate, though, the lightweight series masks were still considered too bulky to be utilized by parajumpers and amphibious landing teams. So they were definitely looking for different solutions. I know for a decent while through early on in the Second World War, a lot of parajumpers and paratroopers used the M2 series training masks, which had a canister directly mounted to the chin piece where a hose would normally be mounted. And later on, the U.S. began to take notice of the British developing the light anti-gas respirator series sometime after 1943 or so, and so that's the development pattern we began to follow. Instead of making the canisters and carriers smaller, we're going to just attach a canister on the side of the facepiece, which is actually something we'd been experimenting with since the 30s, but it never really worked out due to our strange and bizarre methods of attaching a filter to the facepiece. Like, there was literally methods where there was still a short length of hose, but they just let an M10A1 style canister just dangle off the chin. It was very weird. But anyhow, back onto the development of the E6. So, there was several prototypes and variants of what eventually became the E6, and probably my most favorite design was the one where, instead of basically what you see here, they just took a standard M3 or M2 facepiece, and there was this basically just a little like brass trumpet-like metal assembly, which looped from the hose stem over to the side of the facepiece, and that's where a set of 60mm threads was brazed onto it, and it was all held in place by the harness rivets on the side. And it was just ridiculous. It was quite ingenious and innovative, but at the same time, there was no way that they were going to mass produce that thing. And there was probably a slew of other options, such as the stiffness of the metal in relation to the harness tabs causing poor fits on some people, things of that nature. But anywho, the eventual design they came out with that was finalized as the E6, well, not even though that's the experimental designation, is what they did was, early on they used M2A2 face pieces made out of Class B gray rubber, but for production variants, what they did was they took a standard M3-10116 style facepiece, they lopped off the hose stem, they cut a slit near the deflector on one of the sides, because these could either be manufactured on the left or right hand side, although the left-handed model is the most common, but I digress. They cut a little slit in the deflector tubes, and they essentially vulcanized new rubber to both plug up the hose stem and also have a raised port for the 60mm threads to be installed on the side of the facepiece. And that was basically it. The mask was issued with a M7 waterproof carrier, which essentially looks very similar and is actually the same pattern as the later C15R1 carrier for the M9 series masks, but it was made entirely out of black rubberized duck canvas instead of internally rubberized olive drab duck canvas. So there was a couple different variants of the M7 carrier as well, but I'll get into that in a moment. The original M7 carriers that were issued with the E6 variant, the E6-3-7, the ones that were actually used on D-Day, they would have said US with the chemical core insignia, and then either U or UL indicating universal size or universal size left canister stem, and then below that it said Army assault gas mask. Later on, after the D-Day invasions, these masks would receive a designation update to M5117 Army combat service mask rather than E6-3-7 Army assault gas mask, because obviously they were basically shelling these things out just in time for the invasion, and so they didn't really have the time to finalize them or give them a proper designation, so they literally just called them what their original intended purpose for. So they were more or less experimental still as they were headed into D-Day. But anyhow, after D-Day, they obviously, as I said, the designation changed to Army Combat Service Mask, and a few later variants of the M7 carrier replaced the original design used four small button snaps, which were usually nickel plated, or sometimes they were black painted, but usually they were nickel plated. And then later on they used 3 lift the dot snaps, similar to how the C15R1 carrier was designed. And then there was also a variant called the M7A carrier, or the M7A1 carrier, which instead of having permanently sewn on straps to the sides, it had a set of, it had 4 grommets, or eyelets, that used pretty much general purpose style straps where it had clips that kind of clipped into those holes. It was a very weird design. I don't see too many of those, and from what I know, it was kind of unpopular due to its difficulty of attaching the straps. But anywho, that's enough about the carrier. Unfortunately, I do not have a carrier with this, and I'm trying to look for one, but even the carriers are fetching outrageous prices on eBay, and so it's going to be difficult actually getting a decent carrier to go with this mask. And you may also notice that this mask is missing its harness, but I'll get into that in a moment. The masks, the M5 series assault masks, were pretty much used here and there after the D-Day invasion up until, I want to say they were obsoleted around 1958 or so at the very latest. At that point, they were probably mostly being used as training masks, and any usage after that, I know that the Hanford plutonium manufacturing plant used a substantial amount of these post-war. There's actually photographs of them using these with M14 aerosol filters, which is very interesting. I'd like to show that photo, but I'd have terrible editing skills, so maybe another time. But anywho, that's pretty much it on the history. A very important mask in U.S. development, but obviously its days were limited as we were developing what became the M9 field protective mask probably as early as 1944. Like, I'm pretty sure the early prototypes for the M9 were around in 1944, but it was not finalized until 1947. So enough about that. Let's get on to this example itself. So obviously this example looks very mint condition. It's because I've personally restored this, as I mentioned, from the ground up. It was basically a barn find when we originally got this, and I basically cleaned up all the mold from the neoprene. There was like mold and dirt and grime everywhere. I ended up replacing the M8 valve because the original one on there was kind of grody and I still haven't fully cleaned it off yet. The eyepieces I repainted and recrimped. The actual lenses themselves were scratched to hell and they were basically very foggy and couldn't really see through them, and hours of polishing later I finally got them see-through again. You can see the M11 canisters is the later one. Obviously this is the World War II era M11 canisters that would have been issued after D-Day. The ones that were issued on D-Day would have said Crown along in between these little ridges here, and it would have said E3 instead of M11 because obviously it's an experimental canister, but otherwise exactly the same. And you could tell these World War II ones apart because they are made out of steel. They are painted olive drab on the inside. I think it's some sort of primer, and they are a darker gray color, whereas the 1950s ones are a lighter gray and have a body made out of brass and aluminum. Enough about the canister. Looking on the side part here, this is the only thing that I was not able to replace and restore properly is the inlet valve. As you can see, it's pretty discolored, but it is still flexible. It was actually kind of gummy originally, so I wiped it down with some alcohol and I put tons of talcum powder on there and silicone, so hopefully it won't rot any further at this point, but it's kind of hopeful to say the least. I repainted the edge of the canister threads because that was most of the paint was worn off of that. Repainted the lenses, obviously. Replaced all the wire and tape because all the wire and tape was basically rusting through and it was terrible. And you can see a stamp on the chin here. Industrial Rubber Goods Company, manufactured in 1944, which is obviously period correct for an E6-3-7 assault mask used on D-Day. And as I've said, the C4 head harness is missing along with the buckles and tabs because it was basically rotten off when we got it, and I'm basically going to reproduce one entirely from scratch. However, unfortunately, that'll be a long time in the future because I still need to get the bench dies or the rivet dies for my rivet press machined to work with World War II masks, and also need to get the materials to actually make the harness and a sewing machine and yada yada. So enough about that, but it will be replaced. You can see the plug on where the host stem originally was, and you can see the canister port, which is vulcanized onto the side. Really nothing much to see externally. It just is what it is, a very iconic mask. Nothing much to say about it. Removing the paper inside, one thing that's very interesting about the M5 series assault masks is they never had nose cups. I assume this was due to being able to accommodate a wider range of facial sizes and deformities, and they just needed to do it that way to make procurement and issuing much faster and easier for D-Day. But yeah, basically nothing on the inside, just no nose cup, nothing at all. You can see the internal deflector tubes and the M8 outlet valve from the inside, and you also may be able to notice that these rivets are brand new. They still make these rivets that were used on World War II masks. These are the same speculations. They're brand new, made by Scoville. So these are American made. Everything on this mask that I've utilized to restore it is made in America. So I'm keeping true to the original design. So anywho, enough about that. That's really all there is to see with this. I don't know when it'll be fully restored with a new harness. That'll come sometime later in the future. And thanks again to Moulage for scoring this. I'm very happy to restore. This is probably my favorite restoration so far, just because of how well this turned around. Again, I'll probably link it down in the description, like a post on the U.S. Military Forum where I actually restored this and showing off the process. But that's about it. Aside from that, very happy with it. I'm again very happy with how this turned out, and I'm rambling again. So if you have any comments, questions, corrections, or concerns, drop them down in the comments below. I'm Duke Nougat 3D, and I'll see you all later.